I probably should explain why I'm in a sling. I will come out of it. I'm not allowed out of it from, my doctor says, for more than half an hour at a time. So I feel if I tell you this, you won't believe me. And if you do believe me, you'll just laugh at me anyway. So I was cycling through Balgay Cemetery in Dundee, and there was a council truck coming towards me, and I swung and avoided it, and I had headphones in and stuff. I have to say I don't wear a helmet, so that has to be rectified. I was going at fair speed, and you know that moment where you realize that you're going to crash, and there's nothing you can do about it. You see it like in slow motion. And I just saw this grave coming up. So basically, I landed on a grave and cracked my clavicle, which is my collarbone. I didn't realize I'd done it. Really embarrassed. So got up, covered in mud, got back on my bike, cycled down to Clark's, the all-night bakers, ordered a bacon roll, and the next thing I knew, I was on the floor, passed out. So the ambulance came, and people around, "You all right, son? You all right, son?" And I love the way they call you son, even though you're in your 50s. And it's because I look so youthful. And they says, "Have you got any medical history?" And I don't know why. I just said, "No, not really." And for those of you who know, 5 years ago I was in hospital in a coma and not expected to live. So I said, "I'll get up, I'm fine." I got up and I collapsed again, so they took me in the ambulance. And she said, "No medical history." She looked at my notes. She said, "Boy," she says, "you're a minister. You're not." Anyway, the doctor who came to me, she said, "Are you a wee free minister?" I said, "You're not really supposed to say that, but yeah, I am." And then she said, "What happened?" And I told her, and she sat down. She said, "I am so sorry." She said she sat down. She couldn't stop laughing. She said, "I'm a Catholic from Aberdeen." This idea of a wee free minister falling into a grave, she said, I can't get that image out of my head. So, and please don't bother. I've heard it all. Right? It's a grave situation. Up from the grave he arose. You know. And one of my colleagues even rewrote that whole hymn with several verses about cycling ministers. So, anyway, that's the story. Now you know. And yeah, I'm afraid that is a true story. I wish I'd made it up. So I have to. I'm on the route to recovery, but I have to be careful that I don't leave it out the sling for too long. We do live, don't we, in absolutely fascinating and interesting times. I listen to things a lot. I have a great burden for Scotland and for different parts of Scotland and how the gospel has worked in different areas. In this area, of course, historically. But I mean, even in recent years, I come to so many kind of former brethren holes and so on that you know, there has been a massive decline in the church. And sometimes, I think, within the church, people can go, "Oh, for goodness sake, you know, we're just surviving. Let's just keep our heads above water." Well, I kind of want to begin the first session. What we're going to do is, and by the way, I am a free church minister, so therefore, if you want me to talk for an hour and a half, that will be my first point. And I can do it. It's easy done, but I'd rather not do that. So what I want to do is I want to go to 10 o'clock. I'll try and stop by then. And then it works if we have question and answer and discussion. That's usually actually much more interesting. Because what I'm going to cover is so wide anyway that you might think, "Oh, wait a minute, what about this? What about this?" So you'll get your chance. I'm going to stop at 10 and you can just ask questions or you can text them in or whatever. And any question is appropriate. I do a lot of stuff with non-Christians, and honestly, sometimes some of the questions are brilliant. I mean, you kind of get the aggressive ones. My favourite is still, of all time, is still the guy who stood up and said, "Why are you such an idiot?" So I wouldn't ask that if I were you, because I have this instinctive reaction, which is not good, and I keep asking the Lord to help me with it. And I just looked at him and said, "So that I can have an incarnational ministry with someone like you. And when we're done, I'll tell you what incarnational means." Which was not nice, but you can ask any question that you want, because I think, and make any contribution as well. But I want to begin by reading from Revelation chapter 4. And the context of this, the reason I'm reading this just now is I write a thing on a website called Christian Today. And it's a very mixed website. And one of their contributors had just written something about, don't blame God for Donald Trump being elected, because God really had nothing to do with it. And although God is sovereign, it wasn't, it's not what he wanted. And he was basically arguing against the sovereignty of God. And it was such a depressing message. He thought it was being hopeful. And I'm working through Revelation, and I was writing on Revelation 4. So I entitled it, just very simply, Donald Trump is not on the throne, God is. And I think we need to remember that all the time, because this situation, we might think we're in trouble, but imagine you were a Christian at this time. Because you're within probably around 60 years of Jesus' death. And the kingdom is coming, and there's been this phenomenal growth of the church. So, starting in Jerusalem, Samaria, Greece, probably to Spain, North Africa. It's just incredible how the church grew and grew and grew. And then it starts being really persecuted. And one by one, the apostles die. Possibly Thomas did go to India. But they're all dead, apart from John. Minister, as we would say, some would say bishop, but minister in Ephesus. And basically the churches were strongest in that area, and Jesus writes to the 7 churches in that area, what we now know as Turkey, and he's basically saying to all of them except one, you're really in a mess. And then John is arrested, and he's taken to the island of Patmos, and he's probably 90 plus at this stage, and he's going to die, and he knows it. So the apostles are going to all be dead. The church is being persecuted. There's heresy in the church. You read through the 7 letters, and even you read the great letter of Paul to the Ephesians, and then Christ's words to the church at Ephesus. And you're thinking, oh, this is dreadful. It's absolutely dreadful. You talk about persecution. You've got Christians who are being tied to poles in Rome, covered in oil, and set light to so that they can light the streets. Because it was easy for the emperor to blame the Christians for everything. It's the Christians' fault. So you're thinking, what is going on? And many people would have been tempted to turn away. And then we read this. After this I looked, and there before me was a door standing open in heaven. And the voice I had first heard, speaking to me like a trumpet, said, come up here, and I will show you what must take place after this. At once I was in the Spirit, and there before me was a throne in heaven with someone sitting on it. And the one who sat there had the appearance of jasper and ruby. A rainbow that shone like an emerald encircled the throne. Reminder, by the way, remember this is all pictorial. This is a reminder of God's covenant and God's promise. Surrounding the throne were 24 other thrones, and seated on them were 24 elders. They were dressed in white and had crowns of gold on their heads. From the throne came flashes of lightning, rumblings, and peals of thunder. In the front of the throne 7 lamps were blazing. These are the 7 spirits of God, or the 7-fold Spirit, the Holy Spirit, in other words. Also in front of the throne there was what looked like a sea of glass, clear as crystal. In the center around the throne were 4 living creatures, and they were covered with eyes in front and behind. The first living creature was like a lion, the second was like an ox, the third had a face like a man, the fourth was like a flying eagle. Each of the 4 living creatures had 6 wings and was covered with eyes all round, even under its wings. Day and night they never stopped saying, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come. These living creatures, by the way, if you know your Bible, you know it's Ezekiel. Incidentally, if you want to understand Revelation, you need to read the Old Testament. There's almost virtually no verse in Revelation which is not from the Old Testament. And that's really where you want to go, first of all. Whenever the living creatures give glory, honor, and thanks to him who sits on the throne and who lives forever and ever, the 24 elders fall down before him who sits on the throne and worship him who lives forever. They lay their crowns before the throne and say, You are worthy, our Lord and God, to receive glory and honor and power, for you created all things, and by your will they were created and have their being. Now, everything I'm going to say today comes under this cover. And the cover is this. God is on the throne. Always. Always. You hear you've got cancer. God is on the throne. You hear of all the trouble that's going on in the world. God is on the throne. You hear that you're doing really well, that your cancer has been healed. I've got a friend just now who we were told to come, that he was going to die. And he's been absolutely incredibly healed, which is wonderful. I've got another friend who is dying and probably will be dead in a very short while. Both instances, God is on the throne. That is always the case. When I came out of hospital, the first thing I got to do was the joy of going up to Thurso to speak at the British Council, who wanted to do a thing on science and religion. And it was really funny because they thought it was representative of religion in Britain. You know what they had? 2 Muslims and myself representing Christianity. So I thought, that's it. The Free Kirk, we're Christianity, you know. But and they had 3 people on the opposite side. Anyway, this man stood up and he said, I'm a scientist. And he said, the reason I don't believe in God is I've never seen anyone healed in answer to prayer. So I stood up and said, well, here's my speech, forget it. Because now you have. It's me. And I told him what had happened to me. I told him how I was dying. I told him how the Free Church asked for a day of prayer this time 5 years ago in November. And how from that day I began to get better. And you can say it's coincidence. You can say what you want. I know what it was. I know there was a reason that God was waking people in Malaysia at 3 a.m, telling them to pray for me. I know that. But at the same time, there was a woman there, a Free Church minister's wife, he'd been ill the same time as me. I'd been expected to die. He'd been expected to get better. He died. And, you know, I was very conscious of that. And I said at the time, I told them what my son had said, which is the most extraordinary statement I've ever heard from anyone. I'm not saying that because he's my son, because I saw his Facebook post years later, and I still keep it. Because he'd written, at this time 5 years ago, my daughter had been called from Australia because I was dying, and she was told, come back and see your dad before he dies. And my son went to pick her up. They came up, they saw me. I don't remember any of this because I was in a coma. And he wrote this most extraordinary post, which recognizes God being on the throne. He said, I've just been to see my dad, and probably for the last time. And he said, we're praying that he would be healed. But our prayers have already been answered because his greatest problem, his sin, has already been dealt with. So if God heals my dad, our prayer is answered. And if God takes my dad, our prayer has been answered. And I said that. I mean, it's an extraordinary statement. I mean, you can write that in a theology book and say it in a Sunday school class and say it in a meeting. But when you're coming from your father's deathbed, that's a different thing. And that's where your faith is really proved. And I said that at this meeting. And the scientist looked at me and he said, but that's not fair. I said, what do you mean? He said, you're saying that if you were healed, God wins. And if you died, God wins. I said, yep, you've just got Christianity. And that's what this passage is saying. Now, I want us to look at where we're at in our culture just now. And it is depressing. And people go to me, oh, David, come on, cheer us up a wee bit. You know, and just tell us everything's going to be okay. Actually, what I'm going to say to you, it's only scratching the surface. And I've been trying to tell Christians this for a long, long time, and Christians go, no. I mean, there are ones who just kind of get morbid and depressed. Well, that's fine. I was going to say, join the Free Church, you'll be okay, you'll feel at home. But I won't go with that stereotype. You know the definition of a Scottish Calvinist, of course. It's someone who, when they get one day of sunshine, goes, aye, but there's trouble coming. It'll be rain tomorrow. Right? I'm not talking about that kind of thing. But I think some of us live in a wee bubble. And we're not realizing what's going on in our culture. And we do need to realize, not in order to be depressed, because we can't, because God is on the throne. But in order to be better able to communicate to that culture. And I'll give you just one example of why that really, really matters. When you ask someone to believe in Jesus, you might think that makes a whole lot of sense. But what if they don't know who Jesus is? What are you asking them to believe in? I mean, so often in our evangelism, we're just starting at the wrong end. We're just, we're doing stuff that, I'll put it this way. In the 1950s, Billy Graham could fill Hampden 6 weeks in a row. In the 1990s, his son, Franklin Graham, struggled to get 5,000 into McDermott Park. And most of that was Christians busting. I know, I was involved in that. Someone like Billy Graham could come here today and you wouldn't get anywhere near that level of interest. But I'm wanting to say to you, there's an opportunity there for us to get the gospel out. So first part is we're going to look at where we're at. And the second part, I'm really wanting to talk about Christ rather than kind of all the apologetic questions for the second part. But let's begin. Do we have a projector up here? Scotland turned upside down. Why do I say that? Well, in Acts 17, there's a marvelous verse, Acts 17 verse 6, which says this, that these men, in the NIV it says, these men who have caused trouble all over the world have now come here also. I had it in the old King James Version when I was a student in the Free Church College, now Edinburgh Theological Seminary. And it was just my favourite verse. These that have turned the world upside down have come hither also. And there was a Marxist historian called Christopher Hill who wrote a book about the English Puritans called The World Turned Upside Down. And I just thought, this is a great image. This is what happens. You see, when people say, in our culture, people say, we don't mind you being Christian. You go into your wee churches, do whatever you want. It's like, being a knitting club or a Trekkie society or something. We don't care. But real Christianity turns the world upside down. So let me tell you this. I could put £1 million. We're going to plant a church in one of our housing estates in Dundee. And in that housing estate, I could put £1 million to try and deal with all the poverty and everything else. Nothing will change that housing estate more than if half a dozen people there are converted and come to Christ. We've one guy. We call him the £2 million kid because he was a junkie and he's been in and out of jail since he was 16 for 16 years. We reckon it's cost the state more than £2 million with everything, with all the programs, with everything else. He was stealing cars. He was hot wiring cars when he was 9. In fact, fascinating. He was telling us how to break into a house and everything, which is great information. But he was converted. And then what happens? Everything doesn't go swimmingly for him. The drugs community is really strong. Stronger often than the Christian community, to our shame. So there's always people trying to pull him back in, and sometimes there's lapses and so on. But basically, he's gone from being someone who's cost the state £2 million to somebody who's now actually helping provide for others. That turns a society upside down. Basic Christianity turns the world upside down. And that's what I want in Scotland. I don't want to kind of defend Christendom because it's gone, and I think that's a shame, but it has gone. But I want to see our society turned upside down by the preaching of God's word and the communication of Jesus Christ. And that goes for your churches as well. There is nothing revives a church more than someone being converted, just coming in. They're usually your best evangelists as well, aren't they? Because they don't know what you're not supposed to say. And, and how you're not supposed to do things and so on. And it's just great to see. I remember we were having a wee prayer meeting one time, and there's a guy came in from one of the States. He's a care worker. And he wouldn't come to a main service because he was Catholic and he thought he wasn't allowed to go to a Protestant service. But a prayer meeting, that sounded okay. So he used to come and talk to me. He came to the prayer meeting. Third prayer meeting he was at, we just opened prayer. And I heard him going, Father, I thank you for my new faith. I thank you for my new family. I thank you. And I stopped and said, excuse me, you been converted? Aye. And then he was just great. He's a lovely, lovely guy. And, God working in his life. But the ripple effect that has on his family and all around. Because none of them, some are furious. Some are just absolutely enraged. But he's there. He's holding solid. He's still going on. He's doing well in the Lord. And you look and you say, that's what we need. We need that kind of thing in our culture. So, says he, what do I point at? Oops, that went back the way. That one. Okay, what kind of world was being turned upside down? I'm just going to mention these things. I gave a kind of much more detailed talk about this at the Free Church General Assembly. But I want to mention it because I do want us to have an opportunity to discuss it. Here's the thing. Now, this is the most important thing on this bit that you'll get. Every politician, mostly anyway, says we're progressive. And the idea is that we've gone from being a regressive, backward society into this kind of secular nirvana. Now, it's rubbish. And what's happening, actually, is the poor are being left behind. That's what's happening in our culture, and we should be concerned about that as Christians as well. But people live in this kind of little bubble. And to be honest, a lot of it's coming from our education system, especially our universities. where people are being taught human beings are essentially good. And often the only reason that they're not developing and being good is because of religion. So religion, a majority of people in Britain believe that religion is the number one problem. I'm sorry, even in the west of Scotland, even in Glasgow, come on, of course there's religious sectarianism and so on. But there's far more people being beat up or being abused because of sex and money than because of religion. And yet, blame religion, they're religious. Well, I think instead of being progressive, what's happening is we're regressing back to a Greco-Roman pagan view of the world. That was a world that was the world of Acts 17. It was multicultural. There were wars and rumors of wars. There was pollution in the main cities. There was immigration problems, economic recessions, sexual confusion, power politics, media suppression, religious radicalism, and a growing gap between rich and poor. In other words, it's our world. And some Christians go, oh no, isn't that terrible? And I'm going, yeah, but you've forgotten something. It was into that world that the gospel of Jesus Christ came, and it was that world that the gospel of Jesus Christ turned upside down. There's a story told of a man called Thomas Guthrie, who was looking over the grass market in Edinburgh, which wasn't the yuppie paradise that it is today. It was a slum where half the kids died before they got 5 years old. And it stank to high heaven. And Guthrie's standing on the bridges because he'd just been appointed to be minister of that area. And he's thinking, how can I do this? This is just so depressing. This makes, Kilmarnock look like paradise. He's going, no, you're kidding me. And Thomas Chalmers came up and put his arm around him and gestured with his other arm. Sorry, I can't do it. But he gestured with his other arm. A fine field, young man, a fine field. And that changed Guthrie's perspective completely. He went and he set up something called the Ragged Schools movement, which saw tens of thousands of children bought from, above every school was a Bible. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And it was incredible the impact that made. And I think that we need to be realistic about where we're at in our culture. But as gospel Christians, that should give us confidence because we've got the antidote, which is the gospel, which is the good news. So that's the kind of world that was being turned upside down. I think it's the kind of world which we are in. I want to suggest some trends. Secular utopianism, I've kind of mentioned that already. What that is a belief that human beings are essentially good. If we get rid of religion, and if we sort out just a few problems, things can only get better. Now, think of Tony Blair coming to power. What was the theme song? Things can only get better. I'm not making a political point here, but when the Scottish referendum was on, there was good things and bad things about it. But I'll tell you one of the good things. Everywhere I went, people were engaged. And as someone who likes politics, I couldn't believe it. Suddenly it was fashionable again. But what got me was the housing estates in Dundee, which never showed posters or anything at general election times. There were people out campaigning. There were houses covered in flags, and of course we were Yes City, so it was, it was very much a yes say. And I actually loved it. I loved the buzz. I loved the dynamic. Some of it went over the tops. There were always idiots and so on. But I thought this is really good. But I also felt really, really sad because I thought whatever happens, what's given you this hope, it's going to be disappointed. If you lose the referendum, it's going to be disappointed. But if you get it and it doesn't bring what you think it's going to bring, you're going to be disappointed. That's always what happens. Our modern liberal progressives they think that if only everyone follows their principles, everyone will be great. And that's why there's a great divide in society. And I've got to say this about Brexit and Donald Trump and things like that. I know plenty of people who forget the rights and wrongs of both those issues. I'm not going to make any statement about that. But what amazes me is the number of people who think that they're progressive and liberal and tolerant, and anyone who thinks different from them is an idiot or a racist, xenophobic, and so on. And they're so emotional. I never thought in my life I'd see people crying about the EU. I mean, that doesn't make any sense to me. And you've got college kids in the States today. Do you know, Cornell University, I can't believe this. This is meant to be one of the top universities. They've got a cry room for students to go and cry about the result of the election. And they've given them colouring crayons and paper to colour. And I'm going, this is like 5-year-olds. And these are people who are going to be running businesses in the country. What are we doing? But liberal progressive, that's what they think. It's all about touchy-feely, and they're obviously right. But they're not right. That kind of utopianism is very, very dangerous. And when it goes wrong, they have to blame someone. And lo and behold, who will they blame? They often blame the Christians. I used to think, I wrote a book called The Dawkins Letters, and before I wrote that, I used to think most people in Scotland were apathetic. And maybe they are. But maybe they're not. Maybe it's the church that's apathetic and we're just not getting the message out. When we get the message out, you soon find out that people aren't apathetic. You should see the amount of hate mail that I get. It's unbelievable. In the name of love. That's so wonderful, you know. We are for love and tolerance and diversity, and you're a scumbag who should be killed. You know. Thank you. If that's your love, I'd hate to see your hatred. But another problem that we've got in our culture is... this is a guy called Louis Namier. He's very interesting. He's an atheist philosopher. And he's another guy called John Gray, who's also an atheist philosopher. He's written a book called Black Mass, which is fascinating, because he says this: Hitler and the Third Reich were the gruesome and incongruous consummation of an age which as none other believed in progress and felt it was being achieved. When you think about it in this way, I mean, my study at university was history, and I studied Weimar Germany. 1920s Germany and 1930s Germany was the most scientifically advanced, well-educated country in the world, cultured country. It was the most progressive country in the world, and yet it threw up Hitler. How do you explain that? It's very interesting watching all the tears and angst and agony from Guardian writers and others, and one or two of them are getting the truth. And they're saying, this is our fault, we did this. Because we're not really helping the poor. We're living in isolated bubbles. And I do think that that's where we're at, that we're in a world where the people who run that world, and I'm talking about Scotland, and I'm talking about the Scottish government, and I'm talking about most of our councils and so on, where they think that they can make paradise. And they're going to fail. And when they fail, they will look for someone to blame. Now, the next, religious fundamentalism. Religion can be the problem. We have to admit that in lots of ways. Religions can do a great deal of harm. I'm not going to say anything more about that, except to say you don't need a society to become 50% Muslim for Muslim fundamentalists to take over. You need about 5 to 10% for that kind. I was at a meeting in Dundee, and I was so impressed. I've got Muslim neighbours. Mohammed was one of the first people to visit me in hospital. I hate the term Islamophobic, and I love Muslims, which is why I want them to hear about Jesus. But I was at this meeting in one of the mosques in Dundee. Monday night, not a Friday night, Monday night, 300 young men for a prayer meeting. And I was speaking there, and it was great because it was a debate, and there was a Muslim, myself, a Baha'i, and a pagan. And I basically, forgive the expression, stuck the boot into the Baha'i and the pagan, so the Muslims love me. And they came up to me at the end, and one of them says to me, "Oh, David, if it wasn't for Jesus, you'd be a Muslim." And I said, "Thank the Lord for Jesus." But religious fundamentalism, listen, it is a real danger. And in the sense that people understand it. But we will maybe say more about that another time. State fascism. What do we mean by that? Well, you've got the Italian form and the German form and so on, of course, in the 1930s, 1940s. But what I mean by fascism is this. It's the corporate control of the whole of society, either by the state or by corporations. And that's why the important thing here for us to understand, in Scotland, because of the Christianity, and in the United Kingdom, because of Christianity, and our liberals don't recognize this, equality, diversity, tolerance, all their buzzwords come from us. They don't come from them. Don't give up those words, by the way. We're the only people who really believe in them because we're the only people who've really got a foundation for them. Science doesn't teach you equality. You know, science tells me I'm not equal to Usain Bolt. I can't beat him in a race. And I'm not as brainy. As I don't know, Don Curry sitting here. Science says I'm not as good looking as Brad Pitt. You say, oh, I'm equal, I can be whoever I want to be. We live in this crazy culture where people say you can be whoever you want to be. No, you can. Oh, well, I'm a man, but I want to be a woman. Oh, you can be that. That's fine. I mean, I filled out a form, a Wi-Fi thing coming down on the train the other day, and it said, are you male, female, or other? I mean, I tell that to my parents. They're going, what? I said, well, Mum and Dad, I've got some bad news for you. There's 56 others. I know somebody who, first of all, decided they were homosexual, then decided they were trans, and have now decided they're pansexual. I said that the other day, and someone said, what? What's that? I said, oh, don't you worry. There's another whole bunch of words you're going to have to learn, because we're reinventing humanity. But state fascism is where the state... We had this situation where you had Christianity, and you had, if you like, the state, and it was kind of intermingled at one level, but you had separate powers. It's what was called the Trois Kingdoms, the two kingdoms. The state didn't run the church, and the church didn't run the state. But you take God out of the equation, what are you left with? You're just left with the state. So the state teaches you what morality is. The state teaches you what values are. I heard a government spokesman saying about Donald Trump, we shouldn't really let him in this country because he doesn't share our values. We welcome everyone of every creed. And I'm going, don't they teach you logic in school? We welcome everyone, but we're not going to welcome him. You think, where is all this going? I'll tell you where it's going. It's getting where our kids, instead of going to school to be educated, are going to school to get social engineering. And that's happening in all different kinds of ways. It's where our soap operas are used to educate us in the values of the state. And they'll talk as though there are common values. We say, what are they? And you question, and you get called absolutely everything under the sun if you dare to question it. Another aspect of that, consumerist, dumbed-down materialism. You basically got to have the population satisfied. There are two key books here from the 20th century. George Orwell's 1984, which saw a kind of Stalinist controlling state. And he was reacting against Stalin. And then Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, in which he saw something different. He saw a population divided and controlled by predetermined social status, social education, and drugs. And I think Huxley was the better prophet. People in Britain today are told they can be whatever they want to be, but for most, that's just Disney-esque waffle. It really is. Drugs, 15 minutes of fame on reality TV, sex, smartphones, widescreen TVs are the only things offered. Our elites don't tell us to eat cake. They don't offer us bread and circuses, but they do presume that we'll be happy living dumbed-down, mediocre lives with the cultural crumbs from their table. And I think the problem here is education has become more about training people for jobs and social engineering than it is about educating people. I'm from a farm worker's background. My dad was a pigman. I grew up in a culture where I had just as much right as anyone else to go to Edinburgh University. That's all changed. Oh, they'll say that, but it's completely changed. I'm not sure I'd be able to go to university today. Could I afford it? The amount of debt that's involved, and so on. And universities have become businesses. I'm a chaplain at Dundee University. I know where they're trying to get their business from and trying to get money. The whole idea of education for education's sake, which is a Christian concept, is disappearing from our culture. And so people are just saying, oh, if you've got a smartphone, if you've got this, if you've got that, then you'll be happy. We know it's not true. New Age paganism. There are those who don't accept this kind of stuff, and so they rage against the machine. They want spirituality, and so the old pagan religions appear attractive. They're closer to nature, and so on. And, again, we've got to have a sympathy and an understanding for that. But it's so bizarre that paganism has returned to Scotland. And you're saying, nah, don't be silly. Yes, it has. Because paganism basically denies basic things like male and female. It's gone. Any kind of sexual distinction, it's gone. And, it all sounds so spiritual and so wonderful. And I've met people who genuinely are worried that because of feng shui, their toilet might be facing the wrong direction. And they'll spend 10,000 quid getting it refaced. You serious? And then they'll go, you believe in a man rising from the dead? I say, yeah, but I don't believe that my toilet affects my harmony or my inner peace, Not unless I can't get into it. But, sorry. Just be thankful it's early in the morning. Sexual confusion and dysfunctional families. We would probably want to talk about this, but as a broad summary, the sexual liberation of the 1960s, here where I think this has gone wrong. It all sounded so great. It's Dermot McCulloch of Oxford University, who's a professing Christian, had a series on the BBC which about sex in the church, in which it basically said, before Christianity came along, the Greeks, Romans, and pagans were all having sex whenever they want, and they were all incredibly happy. Along came Christianity, Paul and Augustine especially, and they suppressed, and ever since then people have been sexually suppressed, and now we're finally breaking free from that. And isn't it wonderful? And I'm sorry, but I get so angry at that. I say, you middle-class Oxford idiot. Let me take you to a housing scheme in Dundee where I've got 19 kids come into a club. Out of 20, you can't say go home to your mum and dad. You say to one of them, go home to your dad, and he says, which one? What do you mean, which one? My Monday dad, my Tuesday dad, my Wednesday dad, my Thursday dad, my Friday dad. Or the man who is up for murder just now. He's got 15 kids with 9 different women, and in the court he's asked, how can you do this? Oh, it's all right, the state will pay. And I don't blame him, because he's been taught sex is just an appetite. It's like I'm driving down here and I confess my sin. Pulled into McDonald's. I had my McDonald's breakfast, on the way, because that's what I like. I really, really like it. It's there. It's like an appetite. You feel, and they teach that sex is just like an appetite. And you teach kids that. You hand out condoms to 12-year-olds. What do you think they're going to do? And then the things that come with that are just devastating. So the teenage suicides, the despair and the depression. And they watch on television all these glamorous people, and they think, if I'm like this and I'm like that. And you've got 50% of 12-year-old boys in Glasgow and Dundee and Edinburgh, and probably here as well, who by the time they're 12 have seen hardcore porn that I wouldn't even begin to describe to you. And I can't look at it because it makes me feel physically ill. And we're not talking here about Playboy and stuff like that. We're talking about stuff that is absolutely from the pit of hell, and they're seeing it and being told it's normal. How do you expect them to grow up? Sexual confusion and dysfunctional families. That's the whole... there's a thing called queer theory. And it's... I had a debate with Peter Tatchell, who in some ways I like and admire. And please, don't dare go down the route of, you're being homophobic. I'm not being homophobic. I've got homosexual people in my congregation. I don't care who you are. If you come to me and you say, I'm sleeping with so-and-so and we're not married, I don't care if you're heterosexual or homosexual, I'm going to tell you it's wrong. Because it's not what God made us for. And you go against the Maker instructions. Listen, I put petrol in my diesel car. It's not going to work. And if we go against what God says, it's not going to work. And that's, by the way, why Christians should be concerned about this, not because of ourselves and Christian values, but because when people don't follow the Maker's instructions, they get harmed. And you would be upset if there were kids in Kilmarnock or Ayr or Glasgow lying on the street, starving to death. You wouldn't say, oh, well, that's their choice. And you should be just as upset when these kids are being emotionally and spiritually battered by being taught a view of sexuality in the family, which is absolutely is guaranteed to create dysfunctionality. There isn't a single society where it hasn't done so. I'm not going to... That's a long quote. I'll send it to you from Peter Tatchell. Basically, he's saying there's going to come a time when we won't need the term homosexual. Because their point... This is what they're trying to do. They are trying to get rid of sexuality as a distinctive. You're not homosexual or heterosexual. It's fluid. So it's sexual fluidity now. We said that all the time, actually, that people were choosing. Tatchell's saying, now you choose. So that's why the majority of teenagers in Britain who would express a preference won't say they're homosexual, they'll say they're bisexual. Because they just don't know, they're confused. But now it's getting worse, because it's not just getting rid of sexuality, it's getting rid of gender. Never mind male, female. We've got a government that says we want 50% female in boards and 50% female in parliament and so on. But that same government is completely undermining its own position by saying we are going to have taught in every single school that you can choose what gender you are. One of my eldest daughters, 7-year-old, came home from school really upset and asked her mum and dad, "Mum, Dad, what am I?" "What do you mean, what are you?" "Because the teacher told me at school I could choose to be a boy or a girl." You're teaching 7-year-olds that. You know, and they think, oh, isn't this all wonderful, and this is stopping transphobia and all the rest of it. No, it's not. It's creating insanity. And in actual fact, it does real harm to people who do suffer from gender dysphoria, which is a recognized psychological illness. But the minute you start saying all human beings can choose whether they want to be male or female, you end up in the crazy world of a guy I know who went into a university with a camera and said, "If I choose to be a woman, is that okay?" "Oh, yeah, that's fine." Now, he's 6 foot and blonde. And he said, "If I choose to be a 4'6" Chinese woman, is that okay?" And do you know this? These intelligent people said, "Yes, I guess so." I mean, you're mad. Imagine I was standing for Parliament, and let's say I was going for the SNP, and let's say that I turned up as a candidate, and they said, "Sorry, our quota has gone. We need a female." I said, "That's okay, I can fill out a form." "You can do that now. You can go to a post office, fill out a form, and I can say, 'My name is Davina, and I'm a woman. Now you have to accept me.'" Shotts prison. Do you know about this case? There's an 18-year-old who's been charged with rape. He's announced that he's now a woman, and he wants transferred to the women's cells. The only trouble is, in remand in Shotts, if you're in the women's cells, they're open cells, you visit cell to cell. So this 18-year-old rapist, and they've had to apply to the Scottish government to get that excluded. He's demanded that he be strip searched by women officers because he's a woman. That's the kind of insanity where we're going. One more thing. Inequality. I mentioned that before. There just is a growing gap between rich and poor. And that is fed by the corporations, Amazon and so on, and Starbucks. See, what's happened here in our politics is, again, and I'm not making a political point, but the left wing have given up on economic justice. And suddenly equality has all become about sexuality. Because that's easy. It's easy for David Cameron to say, we're now the nice party because we're for equality and justice, so we'll pass same-sex marriage. I was involved in that whole debate, and I know exactly why Cameron did it. And it was entirely a political point. And you find the same on the left, where you get in Scotland the Equality Network. Now, I want to know from an Equality Network, how come kids in some areas of Glasgow have got a 15-year shorter lifespan than kids from another? That seems to me to be unequal. I want to know how the enormous gap between rich and poor in some areas. I want to know the gap in healthcare. I want to know why when my daughter goes to Edinburgh University, there are those who get to live in really nice halls of residence because they can pay more, but others don't. That's the kind of inequality. They're not interested in that. The only thing they're interested in is gay rights, and now transphobia, and soon we'll be on to something else along similar lines. Now, I'm not saying there's no issues, there's no problems, but there are. But our culture seems to be accepting and increasing inequality. So, I want to leave that there. I want to say that's the culture in which we're in, and which I think the church has the answer. Now, I really, really don't want us to say our answer is, they say this, we say the opposite. We've got a bigger picture. And so, if somebody, for example, asks me, I'll finish with this example on the sexuality issue. It's in Glasgow, in Borders. Manager didn't want me there, but I'd been ordered by Borders to have me there. Stuck me down in the basement, place packed, given a question on a topic, talking about God and science. Time for question. He puts his hand up, says, "You're the manager, you're not supposed to speak." I knew it would be hostile because I knew. And he smiled and said, "I want to ask you something." I said, "Yeah, go ahead." He said, "What do you think about homosexuality?" And I just shook my head and I said, "I'm speaking about God and science. I haven't mentioned sex and sexuality. But people use it all the time to test you. You know, it's a shibboleth issue in our culture." And I said, "Look, I'll answer the question if you answer mine first." And he said, "Okay, go ahead." I said, and then we're done, by the way. We're not discussing this. You can discuss when we're private afterwards because it's not fair. for the people who come for this subject. So we got the question. And I said, here's your question. Is there any form of sexuality you think that's wrong? Now, we're in a church, so I won't give you exact words, which he said. But he said, you're a clever so-and-so. And I said, why? He said, because if I say no, you're going to say, what about pedophilia or bestiality or something like that? And if I say yes, you're going to say, how do you know? And I said, I'm not the only clever so-and-so. You're one as well. And I said, because you've given me an honest answer, I will give you an honest answer. And the answer is this. I will give you 5 simple points. Number 1, I'm an IKEA Christian. And what that means is, I go to IKEA, I buy the flat pack chair or bed or whatever it is, I take it home, I haven't a clue how to make it. So I basically lay out the instructions. I'm the kind of geek that counts the screws. And if there's 23 instead of 24, I'm back to the shop. I need another one. I don't know how to do it. So basically, I follow the maker's instructions. So number 1, I follow the maker's instructions. Number 2, I believe there is a maker, that God made us. Number 3, I believe we're made in his image and that he made us male and female. Number 4, he tells us what marriage is. That it's between a man and a woman, and that sex should only be within marriage. So I said, that means for me, well, there's another one as well. I said, and by the way, I said, all homophobia is wrong. Why should I be afraid of homosexuals? I'm concerned about you as a human being. I don't allow sexuality to be an identifying factor. But I said, the last one I want to tell you is this. What I believe, and what I've just told you, is what Western civilization has been based on for 1,500 plus years. What you are offering is a social experiment, which in my view will be completely disastrous, and you have no evidence for whatsoever. But don't you dare ever accuse me of being a bigot and intolerant because I'm upholding something which our society has upheld for 1,500 years, which has been proven to have worked, and which you're offering an alternative which doesn't work. So don't call me a bigot for expressing my view. And he just looked at me and he went, fair enough. And we let it go. And that was it. So I'm saying all of these issues that we're looking at, they're all things that ultimately we can point to Christ. But how we do that, we need to ask. So.